working for the Imperial Sugar Company. I retired as president in 1973, and I'm currently a director emeritus of the Imperial Holly Corporation. I've made a lengthy study of the history of Sugarland and the Imperial Sugar Company, and I've written a book with that title, Sugarland, Texas, and the Imperial Sugar Company. Jim Kempner, the company's president and grandson of Imperial's founder, Mr. I.H. Kempner, would like you to know a little bit about Imperial's background, and I've asked Houston area's noted historian and former newsman, Ray Miller, to tell you about some of the highlights. Imperial Sugar Company is the oldest business in Texas, having begun its long history as a commercial raw sugar mill in 1843, continuously making the same products, sugar and molasses, on the exact site where the refinery stands today. The company, which celebrated its 150th anniversary in 1993, is still going strong, as Ray Miller will now describe to you.
500 years ago, Highway 90 was an Indian trail crossing Oyster Creek at a low water point where the present bridges are located. Until the early 1820s, it was a main road between the Gulf Coast and the Spanish and Mexican headquarters at San Antonio. For almost 300 years, the governments of Spain and Mexico had tried to colonize southeast Texas. They built forts and missions and used the old road to supply would-be settlers. But they simply couldn't clear all the forests, drain the swamps, plant crops, and build cabins and do all the things that settlers needed to do in those old days. This opened the door to the North Americans who had done extraordinary work in settling the eastern part of the United States. Grants of land were made to Stephen F. Austin and others who brought in settlers from the United States. In 1828, Stephen F. Austin, called the father of Texas, awarded 4,428 acres at what is now Sugarland to his assistant, S.M. Williams. The Williams family cleared part of this land, built buildings, and started farming with slave and itinerant labor. The place was known as Oakland Plantation. Within 15 years, in 1836, the prospering settlers from the United States rebelled against the government of Mexico. The Mexican army, after slaughtering the Texans at the Alamo and at Goliad, moved eastward along the old road from San Antonio to Harrisburg, and they came right through what is now Sugarland, damaged some of the buildings at Oakland Plantation, and completely destroyed a nearby plantation owned by William Stafford, another member of the Austin colony. But Santa Anna and his army were soundly defeated at San Jacinto a few days later, and Texas formed its own republic. In 1843, the Williams family built a large commercial raw sugar mill to process the sugar cane grown on the Oakland Plantation and surrounding properties. The 10-foot stalks of sugar cane were brought into the mill directly from the cane fields, cut into pieces and squeezed between two large metal rollers. The juice was filtered and then boiled until it crystallized into brown-colored sugar grains. The remaining liquid was drained into molasses tanks, and the sticky brown sugar was poured into conical molds where it dried into rather hard cones of saleable sugar. This mill was the beginning of what is now the Imperial Sugar Refinery. In 1853, the Williams Plantation was bought by a partnership formed by W.J. Kyle and B.F. Terry. These two young men had fought Indians to get from Texas to California to mine and look for gold during the famous gold rush, and they struck it rich. They came back to Texas and bought the Williams land grant. They changed the name from Oakland to Sugarland Plantation, added 8,000 acres, bringing their holdings up to 12,500 acres, enlarged the sugar mill, and saw to it that the first railroad in Texas came right by their mill. They had one of the largest plantations in Texas with more than 150 slaves. Both men became very wealthy and built large, gone-with-the-wind style homes that became the social centers of eastern Fort Bend County. At the start of the Civil War, Terry formed Terry's Texas Rangers, a Confederate cavalry unit that fought throughout the war. Only 272 of those men came back. Terry was killed at the age of 40 in one of the early battles near Bowling Green, Kentucky. During and after the war, the plantations in Fort Bend County became badly run down. They lost a good part of their management and labor force, and most of the lands were sold. Kyle struggled to keep the Sugarland plantation together, but he couldn't. He died at the age of 61, and the Kyle and Terry heirs were unable to rebuild their rundown enterprise. In 1883, Colonel Ed Cunningham, a Civil War veteran who'd organized a Confederate cavalry unit known as the Mustang Grays, bought the entire Kyle and Terry properties and acquired neighboring lands until he had 20,000 acres. Cunningham rebuilt the rundown plantation, further enlarged the raw sugar mill, and spent more than $1 million building a large sugarcane refinery to make sparkling white refined sugar. This plant received the raw brown sugar from the raw sugar mill, melted and refiltered it, then filtered out the color from the liquid and boiled it into pure white grains of sparkling sugar. The remaining liquid was spun off in whirling centrifuges and became molasses. The refinery was also processing the raw sugar cane brought to Sugarland from a number of raw sugar mills within a 20-mile radius. Cunningham built 2 narrow-gauge railroads to bring sugar cane and raw sugar from the cane fields and from the raw sugar mills to his raw sugar mill and refinery at Sugarland. The refined sugar was shipped out by rail, mostly to customers in Texas and Oklahoma. He used 300 to 400 convicts leased from the state of Texas to work the fields throughout the year. And when the sugar crops came in between October and January, he used transient labor to operate the raw sugar mill and the refinery. The mill and the refinery were then completely idle from February until the next October. Cunningham tried to find a reliable source of more raw sugar for those idle months, but his credit was exhausted and he couldn't bring it off. With his main source of income, the mill and the refinery, idle 9 months of the year, he was being ruined. Cunningham's personal interest in the operations declined, and the people under him allowed the farms and the mill and the refinery to deteriorate badly. By the turn of the century, in 1900, Sugarland was being referred to as the hellhole of the Brazos. Convicts worked in the fields under horrible conditions all year round. The itinerants who operated the raw sugar mill and the refinery were described by the manager as the scum of the earth. It was an isolated, rough, all-male, hard-living town. By 1902, Cunningham had overextended his finances. His labor forces weren't good, he was in poor health and in serious financial difficulties. His deteriorating properties were placed in the hands of a receiver. In 1904, Lincoln Trust and Title Company of St. Louis took over. The company reorganized and refinanced all the properties at Sugarland, but couldn't run it profitably. When it became obvious the business was in danger of closing, Lincoln Trust and Title decided to find a capable buyer to step in and reverse the downward trend. In 1906, 2 successful businessmen saw an opportunity to acquire the entire property on favorable terms. In 1908, the partnership of I.H. Kempner of Galveston and W.T. Eldridge of Eagle Lake bought Cunningham's 18,500 acres and the adjoining 5,300-acre Ellis plantation, which was also in receivership, giving them a total of 23,000 acres, including 2 raw sugar mills, 2 railroads, and the sugar refinery. They named the refinery Imperial after New York City's splendid Imperial Hotel because it had impressed young Kempner when he was a college student visiting New York. The first president of the rapidly growing Imperial Sugar Company was D.W. Dan Kempner, a younger brother of I.H. Kempner. I.H. Kempner had a plan to import raw sugar from Cuba to Galveston and ship it by rail to Sugarland to operate the sugar refinery year-round using the locally grown raw sugar during the 3-month Texas winter harvest period and Cuban raw sugar for the remaining 9 months. This program was almost immediately successful. This brought on a planned growth program to build a complete new company town with all modern facilities and services to attract permanent, reliable, hard-working family-type people to work in the mill, the refinery, the stores, and on the farmlands. In the partnership agreement, the Kempner family, led by I.H. Kempner, was to finance this undertaking, and Eldridge was to move to Sugarland with his family and build the company town and all of its support facilities, improve the farmlands, and bring in tenant farmers and contract labor to replace those convicts. He would then manage the entire operation, consulting with Mr. Kempner from day to day. It was a large undertaking involving a wide variety of needs and skills to build and operate a complete company town almost from scratch. It took almost 15 years until 1926 and a great deal of money to complete the plan. The sugar refinery, as the main backbone of the town's employment, did manage to operate year-round as planned after the first 2 years. At the outset, Eldridge and Kempner had ended the use of convict labor by moving the convicts to the Ellis Plantation and then selling the Ellis Plantation to the state of Texas. Ellis Plantation became a Texas prison farm, as it still is today. The Kempner-Eldridge partnership completely rebuilt the properties. They drained and leveled the farmlands and added 8 miles of levees to protect them from flooding. They also dredged out several large lakes to provide year-round storage of water for the mill and the refinery. The partnership built a complete company town of 450 homes with paved streets and concrete sidewalks, a hospital, churches, and a complete shopping center. They brought in 500 solid, hard-working families and operated the refinery using raw sugar imported through Galveston from Cuba and many other tropical countries. They had a model community with good people working in the refinery, the stores, and on 15,000 acres of farm and cattle land at Sugar Land. By 1926, they had a functioning town of 1,500 people, almost totally self-sufficient. The company furnished everything. Everyone in town and on the farms worked for the company. Each employee received one bill at the end of the month covering just about everything: rent, food, clothing, utilities, medical treatment, and so on. $1.50 a month for each employee covered all medical care. There were 2 doctors employed by the company. Prices in the stores were set at the same level as in Houston. Mr. Kempner said it wouldn't have made much sense to spend millions of dollars for an ideal community to house permanent workers only to cheat them on the price of a can of beans. Also, by 1926, sugar was no longer a local crop. Plant disease, bad weather, and cheaper offshore raw sugar made it inadvisable to continue growing sugarcane in Texas. Other crops like cotton and corn, feed crops, and vegetables became more attractive. The refinery continued operating year-round using raw sugar imported through Galveston or by railroad from Louisiana, as it still is done today. Sugar Land became a fine, secure place to live, and the refinery and the farms prospered. W.T. Eldridge died in 1932, and his heirs inherited his 50% partnership. In 1946, the Eldridge heirs decided to sell their stock in the refinery and the stores, the farms and the town to the Kempners, who then became 96% owners. Mr. I.H. Kempner, who had continued to advise Eldridge since 1906, then took over the management of the entire operation at Sugar Land, commuting from Galveston. During the Depression of the 1930s, the refinery and the farms were very near receivership, as were so many other businesses at that time. Twice, the Kempners mortgaged their own resources to save the businesses and the town. During that time, every employee was utilized by shifting the work around so that everyone had at least a living wage. As a result, people living and working in Sugar Land were probably better cared for than in most Texas towns at the time. In the early 1940s, things began to return to normal, and during World War II, both the refinery and the farms returned to full-time operations. I.H. Kempner's youngest son, Herbert Kempner, became president of the Imperial Sugar Company in 1947, with Mr. Kempner Sr. serving as chairman of the board. They also supervised the operations of the many other activities in Sugar Land. Herbert died in 1953. When I.H. Kempner became less active, his place as chairman of the board was taken by his oldest son, Harris Kempner. The company prospered through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 1990s. By 1959, with the approach of the Southwest Freeway, planned to run directly across the company's farmlands, it was obvious that Houston would soon encroach on Sugar Land. It already was rapidly becoming a bedroom community for Houston. The company decided to sell off its farmlands for residential and industrial development, and under those conditions, the company town couldn't any longer operate as such. The town of Sugar Land was incorporated in 1959, and the homes were sold to the occupants at attractive prices. An elected mayor and city council took over operation of the city functions the company had previously handled. The remaining 11,000 acres of farmlands were sold to large developers, and the town was soon surrounded by Sugar Creek, Sugar Mill, Sugar Wood, First Colony, new territory, and numerous other planned subdivisions. The Imperial Sugar Company, which had refined some 750 hundredweight of sugar in 1908, had grown to around 2 million hundredweight by 1956. Under the Kempner ownership and management, this growth increased steadily and by 1985 had reached 10 million hundredweight, and Imperial was the major supplier of sugar to the southwest United States. In 1971, following the Kempner family's long practice of encouraging younger family members to assume as much responsibility as they could manage, Harris Kempner voluntarily resigned his position as chairman of the board so that I.H. Kempner III, known as Denny, could succeed him. In 1988, the Imperial Sugar Company, under the leadership of Denny Kempner, R.C. Bob Hanna, and the financial counsel of J.C. Jim Kempner, Danny's brother, worked out a plan whereby Imperial acquired the Holly Sugar Company, a beet sugar processing company based in Colorado. Holly's sugar processing facilities are centered in the western United States, with 3 factories in California, 2 in Wyoming, and 1 each in Montana and Texas. The acquisition resulted in the formation of the Imperial Holly Corporation, a publicly owned company whose stock is traded on the American Stock Exchange. The company is geographically diversified with operations throughout the western United States and sales in all 48 contiguous states. The merged company was 2.5 times as large as Imperial had been and was immediately listed as one of Fortune magazine's 500 prestigious companies in the United States. The Kempner family remains in control of the new corporation, holding 60% of the stock. Headed by Denny Kempner as chairman of the board and Jim Kempner as president, chief executive officer, and chief financial officer. The Kempner family has owned at least 50% of the sugar refining operation and managed or helped manage the oldest business in Texas from 1908 until the present time, a span of 88 years and still counting.
Thank you, Ray, for your colorful description of this historic part of Texas and the Imperial Sugar Company, which had its start here so many years ago. Since Imperial and Holly merged in 1988, the company has operated with 2 headquarters locations, one in Sugar Land, the other in Colorado Springs, which has been Holly Sugar's home since 1928. But in order to become more competitive in the marketplace and to take full economic advantage of the merger, Holly's Colorado Springs corporate offices are being closed, and its operations will be consolidated at Imperial Holly's Sugar Land corporate offices. With this latest change, Imperial and Holly are now together as one company with all the key people located in the same place. Thank you, and I would like to say that Ray Miller and I are both grateful for the opportunity to tell you a little about this historic company and the town that proudly bears the name Sugar Land, Texas.